Hi, my name is Dan Gomez, and this is Mental Health Super Omnia, mental health above all. We identify and understand mental health issues and the paths for help. We have two guests with us today. First is Dr. Eli Sheff, one of the foremost experts on polyamory, and most important to us today, an expert on children in polyamorous families. Dr. Eli has a PhD in sociology, is a certified sexuality educator, writer of at least four books, numerous academic articles, probably too many to count. Most importantly, she serves as an expert witness in trials around the country, which of course is going to be our focus. We also have Kevin Fillipelli. Kevin is a licensed professional counselor, national certified counselor, over 30 years experience. He's part of Equilibria psychological and consultation services as a telehealth therapist, seeing adults ages 25 and older with a wide range of issues and concerns. He has a special interest and expertise in working with the queer community, as well as those exploring open and honest ways to practice polyamory and non-monogamy. Dr. Eli, could you start us off by giving us a common courtroom scenario where you have a child of one or more polyamorous parents, and why are you called in?
Yes. Usually I'm called in because someone is threatening the custody of the child and trying to basically either remove or inhibit the custody from the polyamorous parents, but generally not if there are monogamous parents, which usually there are, not from the monogamous side. So, this one case I'm thinking of specifically, actually, there's two I think that are kind of emblematic. The first one is a group that started as polyamorous, um, what they call a four-person relationship, so a quad. And one of the people had a baby with one of the other people, and then decided that they were not interested in continuing a polyamorous relationship, but wasn't clear to their polyamorous folks or to other people. So started cheating, which ironically you can cheat in polyamorous relationships, started cheating with someone else who was ostensibly monogamously married. And this person's spouse definitely thought they were monogamous. So both partners are cheating. Um, the person that had the baby ultimately leaves the polyamorous family and marries the person who had been ostensibly monogamously married. They two get together, and because it was the formerly polyamorous person's baby, they're looking at splitting custody between what's now a triad or a three-person relationship and this kind of conventional monogamous looking dyad. The dyad is not happy about having to split custody. They want the baby full time. The baby was born into the polyamorous family, has siblings in the polyamorous family, definitely knew all three of the people who remain in the polyamorous family. But the person who left the polyamorous family is upset about that now, doesn't want the baby around the other two members of the polyamorous family. Wants either full custody with their ex only having partial, like supervised visitation, which is generally reserved for parents who are dangerous in some way. And there was zero evidence that this parent was dangerous in any way whatsoever, or that the family was dangerous at all. It was only because they were polyamorous that the judge even considered supervised visitation. So the judge ultimately decides that they can do 50-50 custody, only the polyamorous person cannot have the baby around the other two members of their family. So to
Hmm.
have that baby half the time, two people have to move out while the child's father has access to the baby. And these two people have known this baby since it was born, were literally present at the baby's birth, have never shown any indication whatsoever of being dangerous to the child. And it was only because it was a polyamorous family that they restricted custody to the point of basically saying, you're not allowed to have a family if you can only have your partners around half the time and they need to literally move out so the other children can stay in the home and the baby can then visit the home, that it makes the family situation completely undoable. So that I would say is quite common. The number one threat to polyamorous family custody would be another biological parent, and it happens during divorce.
Mm.
Another emblematic case, I would say, um, is when there were these grandparents, and both of the parents, the biological parents, were still together, and they had two children, and the biological mother's mother and her stepfather um, were very upset about the polyamory, were not on board at all, and very judgmental. Quite wealthy and religious, very conservatively religious, and expressed dissatisfaction. And the mother was like, okay, if you are that upset, I guess you don't have to see us or have contact with us. So the grandmother then was quite upset about not being able to see her grandchildren anymore and said to her daughter and the daughter's husband, okay, we got over it. We don't agree, but we're going to accept it. And, kind of reestablished a relationship. And then when their wedding anniversary came up, the grandmother said, why don't you two go have a trip, send us the kids. We'll take care of the kids while you're gone. Then the grandmother refused to return the children. She basically kidnapped the children, kept them in her extremely conservative, very small town with a family court judge that she knew socially, who had literally posted the Ten Commandments in the courtroom, which is clearly a violation of church and state. Um, but the family court judge then awarded the grandmother custody. And to fight that, the parents have to fly from where they live, which is not where this small town is. It's basically across two-thirds of the country, the United States, have to fly in and try to fight this. And they don't have nearly the amount of money that the wealthy and religious grandparents do. So it was incredibly difficult. And for that, I tried to appear remotely because they couldn't afford to fly me in, rent me a car, have me drive to the small town that doesn't even have an airport, um, and stay. I mean, I try to make my services affordable, but that's a lot of money, and they couldn't afford it. And the judge refused remote testimony. So really emphasized the local, either you have to live in this tiny town or you have to travel there. And it's very expensive to travel there because it's not near any major airports. So I would say those two cases are emblematic of the most common ways that custody becomes problematic in polyamorous families. Very, very rarely is it the state, like Child Protective Services or something, problematizing the custody. Generally, polyamorous families remain invisible to the state because they are often not neglecting or abusing the children. And those are the two things
Mhm.
the state cares about. And in fact, generally, these children are very well cared for because they have multiple adults. So they get the opposite of neglect.
Mhm.
And when these adults get stressed out, they can hand off to each other. So you don't have this parent with no resources left, no financial and no personal resources left, which increases the rate of abuse when parents are just tapped out completely and have nothing, no help and nowhere to turn. That's when you are most likely to encounter abusive situations. A parent that is just stretched way too thin is much more likely to abuse than a parent that is very well resourced. So the polyamorous children or children from polyamorous families aren't really experiencing that.
To echo what you said, Dr. Eli, about it being two of the more common presentations, I'm one mental health therapist who practices in one state, in Pennsylvania, and I've had people seek out my services for those two exact reasons. One
Ah,
was almost a similar situation to what you were describing, where somebody in the polycule decided that polyamory was no longer for them, and they were one of the biological parents. And the other one was actually two sets of religious parents who kind of banded their resources together. And quite frankly, my clients in both of those cases were petrified and very high anxiety coming into therapy saying, I'm having panic attacks or I'm having can't sleep at night because they were fearful of losing their children.
with good reason.
Right.
Previously, I would say up to about 10 years ago, if anyone's custody was challenged and they were polyamorous, they always
Yeah.
lost custody of their children. There's been a shift within the last 10 years towards retaining custody and even retaining equitable custody if the parents and the family court is housed in a liberal area. For instance, I'm thinking of Seattle, Massachusetts, New York have all ruled, and California have all ruled positively on
Mm,
polyamorous parents retaining equal custody of their children. But other places that are conservative, more religious, have more conservative family court, um, it's
hmm.
a very real fear that they will lose at least freedom of custody, if not custody completely.
Yeah. And the state that I practice in, we have Pittsburgh and Philadelphia that tend to lean a little more liberal. And then I see people from the middle of the state because I do telehealth, and their concerns are kind of even more um, palpable, I guess I would say, because their courts tend to lean very conservative when you're not near the two
Right.
urban areas in the state. So,
Which is
Now
also
help
true, I
help me
would say, of Eastern Washington.
mm,
Like the
out.
western edge of Washington is quite liberal, but Eastern Washington is
yeah,
very much like Idaho, which it abuts
mm,
against.
yeah,
So we started off with the court, and we want to focus on the court. But in order to do that, we brought up a whole lot of stuff. Some things that people may be very familiar with, or maybe know a little bit about, or know nothing about. So one of the advantages of talking to you, Dr. Eli, is, correct me if I'm wrong, you are the only person who has done a longitudinal study studying uh, polyamorous families, children in particular. You can talk about that. And Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong. You've just reread that study or
correct.
information
Yes,
about that study.
yeah.
So explain the study for it to us a little bit so that we can get a picture, because I want to focus on the children.
So the study I started in 1996, before polyamory was as widely known as it is now. So about 30 years ago. And I started talking only to adults, in part because that's who's visibly practicing polyamory, and also in part because I was doing it as my dissertation research for my PhD. And when you do research in a university, you have to get permission from, it's called an institutional research board or an
Mm-hmm.
IRB. And they were
Mm-hmm.
very concerned about this research into this little studied population, that it might have some kind of negative impact on this minority population, that if you're outed as polyamorous, you can lose your job, you can lose your housing, you can lose your kids. Like, there are real consequences to being outed when you don't want that. Um, so they not only said, no, you can't talk to children, which I didn't even seriously think they would allow, but they also said you cannot keep any identifying information about your respondents that might later leak out. So initially, it wasn't going to be a longitudinal study. It was just going to be this one-off thing. And so I didn't think not being able to have identifying information was that big of a deal. About 5 years later, when I was at a different university, I thought, I really would be interested in how these people are doing, how they're doing over time. And so the only way I could find them was to put out the word among polyamorous communities. Hey, if you talked to me before, I'd really like to talk to you again. That's not a problem in and of itself. The problem is not being able to find everyone who participated in the initial study. And not only couldn't find everyone, but a specific kind of person dropped out at that phase, the kind of person that was doing polyamory in 1996. And then by the time 2001 rolls around, they were like, I'm not doing that anymore. So more likely to be dissatisfied with polyamory, more likely to have encountered something negative enough that it drove them away from the community. So the people I was able to find tended to be the more satisfied people, the people for whom polyamory was working well and who were happy and in these long-term relationships. So I think of it as an optimistic sample, meaning it's not, well, it never was a random sample to begin with. To truly random sample something, you need to know the entire universe of the population and have each member of the population have an equal chance of being selected. That was very much not the case for my research. And for smaller ethnographic research like mine, that is never the case. That's only the case for funded research that's much larger, that has a lot of the population is well known. My research was exploratory. Like, nobody was doing research on polyamory back then. Actually, that's not true. Meg John Barker in England and Maria Pallotta Chiaroli in Australia were also beginning research at that point. But worldwide, it was just the three of us, and we didn't even know about each other yet at that time. So there was literally no way to have a random sample. But without a random sample, you don't have the kind of generalizability that comes. And this is, let me know if I'm getting too sciencey. The upshot of this is that it's an optimistic sample. It might not be as representative of especially the mainstream population of polyamorists now that polyamory has become so popular and so much more widely known. Another way in which my sample is different is that at the time, because it was fairly dangerous to be known as polyamorous, it was primarily white, middle class, highly educated people who were in secure jobs and housing that felt confident enough to volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
So my sample is skewed towards highly educated people, white people, people with professional employment, like healthcare providers, therapists, educators, business owners, people who are stable in their own employment. But even
and
so,
the children.
even even with those caveats, I would say that my research is because I've been doing it so long and I've done so much, not only interviews with this core group, but a lot of participant observation, which means hanging out in polyamorous settings from conventions to support groups to campouts and stuff like that to kind of just hang out with the population and just soak up their vibe and ask them questions. I'm pretty confident that my research is reflective of the mainstream. The children tend to be primarily Generation Z and the younger millennials because the parental generation is mostly Generation X and the younger baby boomers. So it's the children in this sample are actually quite reflective of their generation in that they tend to have much more gender and sexual orientation fluidity than the older baby boomers, let's say, or even Generation X. The younger people, Gen Z, the statistics coming in looks like about 25% are on some kind of LGBTQ spectrum, including gender diversity being potentially non-binary or transgender or pansexual, which a lot of my respondents identify as pansexual, some of them as non-binary, some of them as asexual among the children. And so that's common for that generation, and I see it in my sample as well.
There's a lot of crossover of populations too, right? Like they may be polyamorous, but they also may be non-binary, and they may be gay or lesbian, and so it's not a heterogeneous, is that the word? It's not a heterogeneous group of people.
Not homogeneous, I
Or
would
not
say. Quite.
homogeneous. Yes, it is
Yes,
heterogeneous.
it
Yeah,
is
thank you.
heterogeneous. Absolutely.
You're
And I would
making me
not,
remember my stats or my research class from grad school. That was a long time
yes.
ago.
I wouldn't say that's true of the parental generation, of the Gen
Mm,
X. The vast majority of my sample is cisgender, meaning not
mm,
transgender or non-binary. They identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So if they were born a woman, they still think of themselves as a woman 50 years later.
right.
And the vast majority of the men in my parental sample are heterosexual. The vast majority of the women are bisexual.
Mm,
Of the kids, they are almost uniformly pansexual in identity, if not necessarily behavior. So that even some of them who have what looks like on the outside explicitly heterosexual behaviors may identify as pansexual because they're not saying they're going to be heterosexual forever or they think this is a permanent state
hmm
for them, that they are open to relationships of all sorts, and so they want to have that identity to signal. Just because they're with someone of a different gender right now doesn't mean they will continue that forward or that their gender will continue forward as it appears, which again
mm,
is
hmm
quite characteristic of Gen Z
Yeah.
and to some extent millennials as well, especially the younger millennials.
So the court is evolving, it sounds like what you were saying. How did how did we get from where we were to where we are here?
I would say initially it was activism on the part of gays and lesbians who had a very similar trajectory.
Mm,
That, for instance, in the 1970s, if you were a gay or lesbian parent and your custody was challenged in court, they always took your custody away. There were many custody battles through the 1980s and lots of court precedents set by challenging these child removal practices. And by the 1990s, there was much more chance that being challenged in court would end up with either split custody or custody retention. And
Mm-hmm.
into the 2000s, gay and lesbian parents are not under the threat
Mm-hmm.
that they were before. I'm not saying there's no judicial bias against gay and lesbian parents. It's very clear that judicial bias remains active in court decisions, but it's not nearly as um, common as it used to be, and they have to be much more circumspect about it because there's so much now case law in effect that demonstrates about judicial bias being inappropriate
Mm-hmm.
in court and same-sex parents being just fine taking care of their kids. Now, there's a lot of research on that. So I would say in many ways, polyamorous community and non-binary community, lots of kind of folks who are visible now but weren't visible necessarily at the beginning of gay liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Gay liberation paved the way for these later sex and gender minorities, are kind of standing on the shoulders of lesbian and gay folks who are literally standing on the shoulders of Black people. That it was the
Mm-hmm.
civil rights movement in the United States that started, even the feminists owe their gender oriented liberation to
Mm-hmm.
Black people, starting the entire civil rights movement in the United States. So if we want to trace it that far back,
Mm-hmm.
it's
Absolutely.
it's the original civil rights movement. But then if we jump forward to this kind of more current movement to acknowledge, especially to acknowledge multiple parents, for instance, on a birth certificate. Previously, you literally could only have two parents on a birth certificate, and they were the two parents, either the people who were married. So if a woman is giving birth and she's married to a man, then he goes on the birth certificate regardless of what she said. Even if she was like, no, it's my other partner, they would put the legally married husband on the birth certificate. And so earlier polyamorous families had a lot of kind of shenanigans to try to get the actual father on the birth certificate.
Mm.
Um, or just put unknown, but under no circumstances could you have more than two parents. Well, then along comes assisted reproduction, where we have potentially multiple biological parents
Mm-hmm.
of children. And again, we see the gays and lesbians starting the push with lesbians having one member of the couple donate the egg and the other member of the couple carry the child. So they are both biologically the mother of the child. And then the sperm donor, if they're still going to be involved in the kid's life, they're more of like an uncle figure or something, that all three get put on the birth certificate. And that started in California and then New York, Massachusetts, and eventually Washington. So we see the both coasts, and
Mm-hmm.
especially the Northeast, not so much like Florida, not a good place to try to get three or more parents on the birth certificate. But still, in many places, if you want to add a third legal parent, one of the existing legal parents has to terminate parental rights first before you're able to add a different parent. And that's a very serious and really excessive step. Termination of parental rights is a really big deal and usually only happens if a parent is either giving that child up for adoption or has been so awful for so long that the court removes them from the
Mm-hmm.
child's life because they've been abusive and or neglectful, but have and not just once, but have a very clear record of continuous inappropriate parenting. So to add multiple parents without removing anyone was a very difficult hurdle and really only became unavoidable when you could prove multiple biological parenthood. That's how it
Hmm.
started. And now they're starting to recognize also social parenthood, which is when you act as a parent, you take on the roles, including financial responsibility for the child. And the child views you as a parent, but you're not biologically related to the child. That's called social parenthood.
You mentioned parenting being terminated because of abuse or neglect. And again, one therapist in one state, and people come to me as they want to come to me. But I've never had concerns about that with any of my polyamorous clients, like feeling like I had to make a report or anything. They, as you said earlier, Dr. Eli, the children always seem to be very well taken care of and maybe a bit spoiled and over doted on by too many people, but certainly not any like other concerns as a mandated reporter where I have to sort of keep an ear out for, do I think that abuse is occurring in a household? That never has even come up for me with my polyamorous clients.
I have to say that doesn't surprise me. It also doesn't appear in my data.
Hmm.
And again, I have this optimistic sample, but even so, the hundreds of people that I have observed, probably over 1,000 at this point, um, I think the structure of the family helps people avoid abuse and neglect. Partially, abuse thrives in isolation and secrecy. And polyamorous families in general are quite socially permeable. Not only do they tend to date multiple people or have multiple partners, they also have friends, like they're connected to community in a
Hmm.
way that keeps them from being isolated. So these families that I've studied, they have people over for dinner. They go out and meet their friends and do fun things together. They have game nights at home where people come over and they play board games. It's a permeable social setting that
Hmm.
not only avoids this isolation that's so dangerous for abuse, really thrives in isolation. Not that every isolated family is abusive, definitely not, but it's much harder to contain your abuse if you have this permeable life. It's much more likely to be noticed or come
Hmm.
out, or the person being abused is going to have resources to ask for help if they have this a lot of contact with people outside of the abusive situation, which is why so many abusers work so hard to keep their victims isolated from
Hmm.
social support. Um, and I think another major cause of child abuse is an overwhelmed parent with too little resources, not enough sleep, never had the ability to actually take a break, working full time, comes home, doesn't have the bandwidth to parent because there's no one to help them. And the polyamorous families tend to be the opposite of that, much more collaborative with the parents supporting each other,
Hmm.
giving each other breaks, spreading the nighttime work of caring for crying infants around so that, in that first year of life, the parents are getting a lot more sleep if they have multiple people in the household to take care of the baby on deck. One family, um, their second child had colic really bad. And colic is when the digestive system isn't working that well and they have like gas and it really hurts. And tiny babies don't have a lot of control over that. And it just hurts bad and they can't really say, ouch, this hurts. So, really, the only thing they can do is cry. And this infant would be awake screaming all night. And the mom said to me, if I had been alone with this child, I really see now how people shake their babies. They get so desperate for sleep that they
Mhm.
shake their babies. And this baby was never shaken because she would only have to be up all night every third night. So she could get 2 solid nights of sleep. And then the third night, she'd be up all night. Because the other 2 nights, there were 2 other partners on deck. So all 3 of them got 2 solid nights of sleep and then 1 night awake, and then 2 solid nights of sleep and 1 night awake. And while that's not ideal, it's much better than every night
Then
awake,
then no
never
nights of sleep.
getting
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So she really felt like having those multiple parents made a huge difference for that infant because if it had been just her, she said that she'd never shaken the baby as it was, but she said she could see how people, when they get so desperate and just so at the very end of their rope, want to shake the baby. And the prevalence of shaken baby syndrome indicates that people do that. And they're not trying to kill their baby or hurt the baby. They just want the baby to sleep so they can sleep,
Hmm.
you know? And it's desperation generally. So these well-resourced families don't have that level of desperation. They have more resilience within themselves, which translates to more resilient parenting.
One of the issues
So
that
I'm,
oh, go
oh,
ahead, Dan. I'm sorry.
no, please, that's fine. Go ahead.
I was just say one of the issues that often comes up in working with polyamorous individuals and children is, you've talked, Dr. Eli, about how for some of them it's very dangerous to be open, and they have young children who sometimes don't know when to not say something, and maybe could we talk about that a little bit and about how to kind of help these parents educate their children about why this has to maybe be a secret.
Absolutely. For one thing, unless someone draws the polyamorous family to someone else's attention, generally they can kind of pass invisibly as a monogamous family with good friends or roommates or, a divorced family that gets along really well.
Right.
So, because there are so many children in elementary, middle, and high school with multiple parents because of divorce and remarriage, um, they don't stand out really if they have
Having four
multiple
parents show
parents.
up to the parent-teacher conference is just normal, and nobody has to explain. These are
Very
just all people
commonly.
that are there because they care about this child's academic performance.
Yes. However, when the child might say something to someone to draw attention, what I generally encourage people to do, or what I learned from my respondents, and now I encourage others to do, is to present it as an issue of privacy and not shame. The children don't need to think, oh, this is a shameful thing my parents are doing, so we need to keep it a secret because it's wrong and bad. It's not wrong and bad. If everyone knows what's happening and everyone has equal ability to negotiate it and set boundaries that are respected, that's good. That's great. That's better than some monogamous relationships. Um, so it's not, especially if the parents are not ashamed of it, I encourage them to transmit the idea that this is fine. What we're doing is okay. However, some people get upset about it, and it's not really their business. So we're going to have this as a private issue within the family. And older kids, like tweens and teens, they can understand that. For
Hmm.
little kids, it's you can explain it to them like, how when we're at home, it's okay if we don't have clothes on. Like you get out of the shower and you run around naked for a second and it feels kind of good to be naked. And, then you put clothes on and it's not that big of a deal. But when we go to school, we always wear clothes, not because we're ashamed to have skin, but because being naked is a private thing for home. And when you go to school, you wear clothes. Talking about the polyamorous family is the same kind of thing. It's a private thing for home, but we don't do it at school, just like we don't run around naked at school.
Hmm.
Um, and that seems to be pretty effective. The one thing I would say is be careful with that if your child has another parent and they can't tell the other parent. It's really inappropriate to put a secret on a kid
Hmm.
that they have to keep secret from their other parent. You don't put them in that position,
Right.
especially a little kid. Little kids are not good at keeping secrets, and they don't deserve that responsibility. So if you are in a situation where your ex might file for custody if they find out, then either wait to be polyamorous until that kid is older, or keep your relationships segregated from your child to the point that they don't have to manage your secrets for you.
Hmm.
If at some point they figure it out, then give them honest and age appropriate information. You don't want to gaslight your kid and say, no, there's nothing happening here, because if they've figured it out, then they'll either think, oh, shit, I know this secret now. I know, dad's cheating on my other dad. And,
Hmm.
I saw him kissing somebody. And now I've got this terrible secret that could explode the family. You don't want to put your kid in that position either. So if they figure it out, be honest with them. And
So,
especially
Dr.
if they
Eli,
ask you questions, give them age appropriate and honest information.
I've got to imagine that in many cases, kids figure out a lot of this because kids are kids, naturally inquisitive. They're observing. But let me ask you a couple of quick questions. First thing that pops into your head, so that we can kind of nail a few points. Children of polyamorous families, or of having one parent of at least that's poly, if you will, are they less adjusted, just as adjusted, or more well adjusted than typical children, whatever typical children may be?
I would say the kids in my sample are
Better adjusted.
than
Okay.
better adjusted
And
than
you clearly gave reasons, because the parents are able to spread the work. And by the way, the colic example, my very first child had colic, and she cried from 5 to 9. She started at 5. You could set your watch, and 9 o'clock she stopped. Again, you could look at your watch. It was always 9.
thank
I would get
goodness.
home from I'd get home from work at 7. My wife would hand me the baby, go someplace else in the house. I'd be with the baby for 2 hours. And it was fine. She had the baby for 2 hours. I had the baby for 2 hours. It worked. Right. And then 5, 6 weeks later, baby stopped and everything was stopped crying. Everything was fine. But that is a very difficult subject. And I completely understand the person in your example saying, hey, I would love to share this burden with other people. I'm sure they love their child, but that is a huge burden. Um,
Absolutely.
what is the most misunderstood part of being a child of one or more polyamorous parents?
I think that the parents are having this constant orgy, and the child gets home from school and has to walk through the kitchen that is littered with condoms and people hanging from the chandelier having wild sex.
Mhm.
That just never happens. I'm not saying wild sex never happens, but it never happens in the kitchen in front of the kid.
Okay.
Um, Polyamorous parents do have sex, but they have sex behind closed doors when the kids are asleep, most commonly, actually, Or sometimes when they're taking a nap, meaning sometimes the parents will set the kids up with, you get unlimited um, screen time now for the next 2 hours. You get screen time. Here's pizza. Here's all the remotes. Here's the game, the game controller. 2 hours. Just don't bother us. We're here, but leave us alone. That kind of
Um,
parenting is when they have sex.
okay. All right. Uh, in a very recent podcast that we just did, hasn't been released yet. We ended up talking to someone who was in an open relationship or is in an open relationship. Very fascinating thing. Described how they got into it, et cetera, et cetera. I got the impression in talking to them that it happened later in life, if you will. Okay. After children or after one of them had children, et cetera. Does this does this polyamorous activity occur for people as they have been married 20 years and it's that their lives have changed, or 30 years? Or is it something that occurs when you're 18?
All of the
Generally.
above. I would say there are some young people who know right away that they really appreciate that kind of freedom and ability to negotiate relationship parameters, and they just jump right into it. There are people who maybe have wanted it for a long time, but haven't seen it as an option, or didn't even think, just thought maybe the only options were monogamy or cheating and didn't want to cheat, felt bad about that. So just were monogamous. And then either their spouse dies or they get a divorce or the kids move out. And then there's this entire cadre of people who become polyamorous much later in their lives. And in fact, there's a phenomenon I'm seeing now in nursing homes and other kind of retirement care facilities where generally the gender ratio is fairly skewed. A lot more women are still alive in their 80s, for instance, than men. So the men that are left around, if they are polyamorous, sometimes women who would have never considered polyamory previously think, oh, actually, they kind of like the idea of having some guy that comes over like once a week and they can have fun. She gets affection, attention, maybe they have sex, maybe they just make out, sex as you get much older, kind of heterosexual sex tends to deprioritize the penis because it's not as reliable as it was in your 20s. Um, and then she's really happy for him to go away. And she gets back to the rest of her life. She doesn't have to do his laundry, make his food, manage his medications, make him doctor's appointments, write thank you notes to his grandchildren. She's happy to have this Mr. Tuesday afternoon fun time. And then she gets back to bridge with the ladies and hanging out with her grandchildren.
Well, perhaps there's something to look forward to for some of us, anyway. Let me ask you a question. I'm just confused based on something that you said, using all these terms, pansexual, et cetera, et cetera. Is is Are we talking here about biology, right? So when I went to college, I met a guy, or he was in the same dorm. Great guy. He came out just as soon as he came to college. In talking to him, it came out gay. In talking to him, it was clear he always knew he was gay. He just had never said anything to anybody until he gets to college, and then he told everybody. Unfortunately, this was some time ago, and the AIDS cocktail hadn't been discovered at that point in time, so he succumbed to AIDS, unfortunately. Great guy, but at any rate, we're clearly biology. I mean, It just was. Okay, that's what he was interested in. He wasn't interested in girls, etc. Okay, they were fine as friends, but not as romantic partners for him. But you've mentioned all these different things. Is it a lifestyle or is it biology?
I would say, again, it's both, all of the above. For some of my respondents, they are wired as wanting multiple partners. They have never been comfortable in a monogamous relationship. They've either never agreed to it because they knew they couldn't sustain it, or if they did agree to it, they always cheated. They always felt terrible until eventually they just said, look, I don't do monogamy. And eventually, when they find the word polyamory, they're like, oh my goodness, like that describes my experience. And for those folks, I think of it as an orientation for them. That one of my respondents, who that was her experience, that she tried multiple times to be monogamous and just could never do it, couldn't sustain it. She said it was like trying to wear a pair of shoes that were 3 sizes too small, that she could maybe smash her foot in there briefly, but she couldn't wear them long. They really hurt, and she certainly couldn't walk comfortably in them. So it wasn't sustainable. And that polyamory felt like finally finding shoes that were actually comfortable, or even just being barefoot. For other
And you know what? That
people,
makes sense, right?
I really think it is a choice or a lifestyle, that they can be polyamorous with some partners in some settings, and at other times in their life or with other social opportunities, monogamy is just fine for them. I myself feel like I am wired for monogamy. I have tried to be polyamorous in the past. I tried for a good 30 years and I just can't do it. When I am in love with someone, I really only love one person at a time, and trying to change that for me didn't work. So I can
Right.
understand how
Mhm.
people can be wired for polyamory and how some other people are under no circumstances could be polyamorous. I think the majority of people are in this middle ground where it could work for them under specific circumstances or at specific times. It's always much easier in the world of multiple partner relating to envision yourself having multiple partners. What is much more difficult is if you love someone deeply, to then give them the room to have
Right.
multiple partners. And for people for whom they're like, oh, of course, that's not a big deal at all. Why would that be a big deal? They tend to be more wired for polyamory. I'm not saying that people who do experience jealousy when their partner goes off with someone else can't be polyamorous, or they're miswired or something. I think that's probably the majority of people, and people learn how to manage that. But
Right.
for some people, that feeling doesn't exist, which took a long time to convince me of that.
Sure. Sure. It's interesting, your description, your first part of your description about somebody that decides, or that from a biology standpoint is polyamorous. It actually describes the last person that we had on the podcast. We haven't released it yet. But literally, she said that she cheated in every relationship until she finally just said, look, this is who I am. She had a partner, a husband who was fine with that, and was fine with the lifestyle, if you will, and off they go. I want to be respectful of both your time and Kevin's time, so I'd like to kind of summarize, or like to each of you to summarize, our discussion, and kind of, and in particular, in your, from your perspective, Dr. Eli, where you're going to go from here. But so I'm going to give you the last word, Dr. Eli. So Kevin, give us a quick summary here. What are you thinking?
Well, I'm really fascinated by the fact that the information that Dr. Eli found in her polyamory family study, I see that replicated in the counseling room, right? The same issues, the same concerns. Jealousy comes up, right? Jealousy. There are people who come to therapy and say, I can't be polyamorous because I still feel jealousy. And, having that experience that polyamorous people feel jealousy, we just handle that differently. We respond to it differently. It means something different to us. It means that we have to up the communication, not necessarily,
Right.
do that. So I really think that um, going forward, I think what we need is kind of what we're doing right now. There are programs out there. I think, Dr. Eli, you're even involved in a program that helps to certify mental health professionals in polyamory and in consensual non-monogamy. I think we need to continue from a therapy standpoint. We need to continue to educate our our people about polyamorous relationships so that research can be done, so we can get even more studies done. So right now we're operating based on what we know are best practices, what people have learned works and doesn't work. And I think it would be really beneficial if we actually had double-blind placebo-controlled studies or something that was, able we were able to kind of look to the research instead of right now I consult with colleagues, right, which is great, but I'd like to also be able to consult with research.
Good. Excellent. Dr. Eli, what's your summary and where are you going from here?
Well, first of all, I think Kevin's idea of the double-blind study is ideal, fantastic, and that requires funding. And there has been, to my knowledge, literally no funding for study of polyamory. I tried and tried to get funding when I was still in academia, and my inability to gain funding propelled me out of academia, unfortunately. So there's a bid for funding of research, please, somebody out there. Um, Secondly, I would say my most important finding is that there are no issues for polyamorous families that are only occurring in polyamorous families. There are no issues that are idiosyncratic to polyamorous families. Every issue that they encounter is a family issue. So, for instance, stigma. Polyamorous families encounter stigma. So do LGBTQ families. So, divorced families used to encounter significant stigma that has waned over time. Interracial families have encountered stigma. All sorts of families have been families with mental illness, like a lot of family stigma is not brand new, didn't just come into being with polyamory. Parent partners that leave. That also happens in families that have divorce, families that have somebody die, families with familial alienation, where somebody has a fight and then goes no contact with their family. Any issue you could think of that happens in families happens in some polyamorous families, but other families too. There's no disadvantages that only happen within polyamorous families. However, they do experience some advantages that don't happen in other families. This kind of pooling of resources is not specific to only polyamorous families. It also happens in blended families and intergenerational families, but it's a benefit to polyamorous families, these pooled resources. And I would say the ability to have a relationship that can survive and even thrive through one of the people falling in love with someone else. That is specific to polyamory. In most monogamous families, if someone falls in love with someone else, that signals the end of the family. Or cheating, which is corrosive because it's lying, it's hiding things, it's manipulation, it's, imbalance of power and control. So, yes, cheating is corrosive. Polyamory is not corrosive in that same way. And in fact, that's a benefit to polyamorous families that one of the people involved can fall in love with someone else. And rather than fracturing the family can actually include that person and becomes bigger and better resourced and even more filled with love. So that's only in families that allow for multiple partner relationships. And finally, the kids are in good shape. They learn a lot of emotional skills in terms of how to communicate and how to manage feelings and how to manage conflict and how to talk about difficult things and how to how to come from different perspectives. They have a wide range of role models, more than just two. Um, so the kids from these polyamorous families, at least the ones in my sample, are doing great. They are entering adulthood with a lot of emotional resilience, a lot of communication skills to fall back on, and the ability to create wider networks of social support for themselves. They come out of a network of social support that they can fall back on, and they can go forward from their family and create this network of social support, which actually, whether it's romantic partners or friends, or, it doesn't always have to be about sex, but they can create in their 20s, in their 30s, these networks of relational and social support that actually make life much easier to manage than when you're trying to do everything by yourself in isolation.
It's interesting. I wonder, that would actually be something I'd be very interested in seeing a study on, whether the kids have developed skill sets that actually make them better in the marketplace, better, more happier people, and better in the marketplace. So both a financial consideration and a happiness consideration. Well, but thank you very much. Let me summarize if I could, or close if I could. Our sponsor today is Equilibria Psychological and Consultation Services, an insurance-based provider whose mission is to help individuals achieve their personal potential and long-term growth by compassionately and respectfully helping clients live in balance. Visit equilibriapcs.com, equilibriapcs.com. You can look for them on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You can also look for me on Instagram, Daniel J. Gomez 24, and on LinkedIn. Now for the disclaimer. I am not a medical professional. That's probably pretty obvious. And I am not providing medical advice. The opinion of our speakers is solely their own.